Look, let me start with something that probably feels uncomfortably familiar because if you've ever seriously tried to save money, you've lived this exact moment before. You save your first $1,000 and it feels huge, like you finally proved to yourself that you're not terrible with money and that maybe you can actually do this. Then 5,000 happens, then 10, and for a brief moment it feels like you're ahead and doing better than most people around you. You start thinking that if you just stay disciplined and keep repeating the same habits, everything else should fall into place. Then you aim for $50,000 and suddenly the whole process feels heavier and slower in a way you didn't expect at all. Saving stops feeling exciting, progress feels invisible, and expenses somehow start screaming for attention. You catch yourself asking how this can possibly be harder than getting to 10,000 when you already proved you have discipline and control. And without realizing it, frustration slowly replaces motivation. My name is Alex, and I spend way too much time thinking about money and why it messes with people's heads the way it does. If you feel like you're doing everything right but still not getting ahead the way you expected, hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you. Here's what most people don't realize about the jump from 10,000 to 50,000. This stage isn't about saving habits anymore, it's about pressure. When you saved your first 10,000, your life was probably simpler and your responsibilities were smaller. At 50,000, life quietly demands more from you whether you wanted to or not. Rent is higher, expectations are higher, emergencies are more expensive, and every mistake suddenly has real weight. The margin for error shrinks at the exact moment you need it most. Now, you might be thinking this is just an income problem and that making more money would solve everything, but if that were true, high earners wouldn't feel just as stuck as everyone else. Here's something that surprised me when I first looked at the data. According to Federal Reserve surveys, a significant portion of households earning over six figures still live paycheck to paycheck. That tells us something uncomfortable, because income alone clearly isn't the escape hatch people think it is. What matters is how much of that income is already spoken for before it even reaches your account. At 10,000 saved, every dollar feels like progress and momentum. At 50,000, every dollar already has a job, and most of those jobs are defensive. You're not saving to get ahead anymore. You're saving to protect what you've already built. And psychologically, that shift drains energy fast. Your brain treats gains and losses very differently, even when the math says they're equal. Losing 5,000 hurts far more than gaining 5,000 feels good. So when your savings start feeling like something you could lose instead of something you're building, motivation naturally drops. That's not a character flaw, that's basic human wiring. Here's where the math quietly starts working against you too. Saving 10,000 on a modest income feels possible, but saving 40,000 more does not scale the same way. The first 10,000 might take a year or two, but the next 40 collide with lifestyle, family, and long-term commitments. Those commitments don't care about your goals or your spreadsheets. This is where it gets really interesting, because this stage exposes how fragile most financial plans actually are. They rely entirely on consistency in a world that is anything but consistent. One car repair, one medical bill, one job disruption, and suddenly you're not building anymore. You're recovering. And recovery never feels like progress, even when it technically is. Now, you might be thinking this means saving is pointless or that the system is stacked against you. But the truth is more uncomfortable than that. Most people try to reach 50,000 using the exact same strategy that got them to 10,000. And that strategy quietly stops working at this level. $10,000 is built with discipline, and discipline is mostly about saying no to small things. 50,000 requires something different, because saying no harder doesn't suddenly create more room. Discipline controls spending, but it doesn't change direction. If your income only flows one way, all you can do is squeeze harder. Here's what most people don't realize. At this stage, effort stops compounding and starts colliding. Every extra dollar you try to save now competes with real obligations, not impulse buys. You're not cutting coffee anymore, you're cutting comfort, flexibility, and margin. That's why this stage feels emotionally heavier, even if the math looks similar. You're no longer optimizing habits, you're negotiating with your life. Now, you might be thinking this means you just need more willpower. But willpower breaks when pressure becomes constant. Psychologists call this decision fatigue, and it shows up fast when every choice has consequences. Your brain eventually starts avoiding decisions that feel costly, even if they're logical. This is why people plateau here for years without understanding why. They don't run out of money, they run out of emotional capacity. And here's the part nobody likes admitting. A lot of people at this level aren't actually underpaid, they're overcommitted. Their future income is already promised to their present lifestyle. Car payments, rent choices, subscriptions, expectations from family, expectations from themselves. None of these feel optional once they're locked in. So every raise gets absorbed before it ever creates space. And that makes progress feel fake. This is where it gets really interesting because this is also where math finally starts to matter more than motivation. Small percentage changes suddenly outweigh big emotional efforts. If you save 10% of your income, going to 15 feels painful. But cutting a fixed cost by 10% can permanently free cash without willpower. This is why leverage matters more than discipline at this stage. Leverage reduces required effort instead of increasing it. Here's a simple example that makes this obvious. If your fixed monthly costs are $3,000, you need $36,000 a year just to stand still. Every dollar above that is fighting uphill against gravity, but if you reduce those fixed costs by even $300, the math shifts permanently. Now your baseline is lower, and every future dollar goes further. That's leverage. Most people never look at their finances this way. They focus on income growth while ignoring the floor they're standing on. And the higher that floor gets, the harder 50,000 feels. Because the target isn't moving, you are. This is why some people hit 10,000 quickly, but stall forever after. Their financial structure never changed. They built savings on top of instability instead of stability on top of savings. And that always collapses under pressure. Now you might be thinking this sounds restrictive or boring. It is at first. But boring is exactly what creates momentum later. Stability feels dull until you realize how rare it is. This is also why this stage feels lonely. Most people around you are optimizing for comfort, not resilience. So when you start making decisions that reduce dependency instead of increasing pleasure, it feels wrong, even when it's right. Here's a shift that changes everything. You stop asking how to save more and start asking how to need less. That question flips the entire game, because needing less creates options, and options create control. Control is what finally makes progress feel real again, not the number itself. This is where the math starts to matter more than motivation. Small structural changes begin to outweigh big emotional effort. Saving 10% and trying to push it to 15 feels painful and exhausting. But cutting a fixed cost by 10% permanently frees cash without daily discipline. And this is the difference between effort and leverage. Now, effort demands constant energy, leverage quietly changes the rules. Here's a simple example that makes this obvious. If your fixed monthly costs are $3,000, you need $36,000 a year just to stand still. Every dollar above that amount is fighting uphill against gravity. You're not building momentum, you're resisting pressure. But reduce those fixed costs by even a few $100s. Now your baseline drops and every future dollar goes further. That's leverage in its simplest form. It changes the math without demanding more willpower. Most people never look at their finances this way. They focus on income growth while ignoring the floor they're standing on. And the higher that floor gets, the heavier 50,000 feels. Not because the number is big, but because the structure underneath is weak. This is why some people hit 10,000 quickly and then stall forever. Their financial foundation never actually changed. They built savings on top of instability instead of building stability first, and instability always collapses under pressure. Now you might be thinking this sounds restrictive or boring. At first it absolutely is, but boring is what creates momentum later. Stability feels dull until you realize how rare it actually is. This stage also feels lonely in a way people don't expect. Most people around you are optimizing for comfort, not resilience. So, when you start making decisions that reduce dependence instead of increasing pleasure, it feels wrong, even when those decisions are exactly what you need. What most people don't realize is that this discomfort is a signal, not a warning. It means you've outgrown the strategy that got you here. You're no longer trying to prove you can save money. You're trying to build a system that doesn't require constant effort. This is the point where many people quit, not because they failed, but because the feedback feels confusing. Progress stops feeling rewarding before it starts compounding again. At 10,000, every deposit feels like a win. At 50,000, wins are quieter and losses feel louder. That doesn't mean you're doing worse. It means the game has changed. You're no longer building safety, you're building independence. And independence always feels unstable before it feels free. That's the part nobody puts on a thumbnail. So if you're stuck around this level, don't assume you're behind. More often than not, you're right at the threshold. The people who break through aren't the most disciplined. They're the ones who stop relying on discipline alone. They lower fixed costs, increase flexibility, and build buffers that buy time. Time is the real asset at this stage. Time lets you make better decisions. Time turns setbacks into delays instead of disasters. And once you have time, 50,000 stops feeling heavy. It starts feeling inevitable. If this video helped explain something you've been feeling but couldn't put into words, hit like and subscribe. And remember, the hardest part of building real financial stability usually comes right before things finally start to change.